What happens when a single moment of injustice collides with a power no one saw coming? The afternoon sun hung heavy over the parking lot of Riverside Shopping Plaza, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Shoppers moved in and out of stores with their bags and their routines, unaware that in less than 5 minutes, everything ordinary about this Tuesday would shatter. Near the entrance of a high-end boutique, a black woman in her late 30s stood beside her silver sedan, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a white blouse, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Her name was Dr. Amara Stone, though no one in that parking lot knew it yet. She had just finished loading shopping bags into her trunk when the patrol car pulled up behind her, lights flashing without sound. Officer Grady stepped out first. He was a bulky man in his mid-40s with a ruddy complexion and a permanent scowl that seemed carved into his face. His partner, a younger officer named Mills, hesitated by the passenger door, his hand resting on his belt. Grady approached Amara with the kind of swagger that announced authority before words ever could. He didn't ask. He demanded. License and registration, now. Amara turned slowly, her eyes meeting his without flinching. There was no panic in her movements, no stammering apology. She simply reached into her purse with deliberate care, pulling out her wallet. "May I ask why you've stopped me, officer?" Grady's jaw tightened. "You match the description of someone involved in a theft. We got a call." "A theft?" Amara's voice remained steady, almost curious. "What was stolen?" "That's not your concern right now. What is your concern is doing what I tell you to do." His tone sharpened, each word a small blade. A few shoppers had begun to notice. Some slowed their pace, others pulled out their phones. Amara handed him her license. He barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the hood of her car. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." She didn't move immediately. Her gaze shifted past him, scanning the growing crowd, then returned to his face. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I'll decide that," Grady snapped. "Now step back before I make you step back." Mills finally spoke up, his voice quieter. "Grady, maybe we should just stay out of it, Mills." Grady didn't even look at him. His focus remained locked on Amara, and in his eyes was something uglier than suspicion. It was contempt. It was the kind of look that reduced a person to a single assumption, a single story he'd already written in his head. Amara took a slow breath. Then, with the same composed grace, she stepped away from her car, her hands visible at her sides. Grady moved in closer, circling her vehicle like a predator inspecting prey. He peered through the windows, checked the trunk she'd just closed. His movements were theatrical, designed to humiliate. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, loud enough for others to hear. The words hung in the air like poison. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone whispered. A phone camera flashed red, recording. Amara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Not yet. Grady returned to stand in front of her, arms crossed. "Empty your purse." "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Empty it, right here. Let's see what you've got in there." Mills shifted uncomfortably. "Grady, come on. This isn't—" "I said stay out of it." Grady's voice boomed across the lot. He turned back to Amara, his face inches from hers now. "Empty the purse." Amara's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the effort it took to contain her fury. Slowly, she upended her bag onto the hood of her car, a wallet, keys, a phone, lip balm, a hospital ID badge. Grady picked up the badge, squinting at it. His expression faltered, just for a second. Then he tossed it back down. "So you work at a hospital. Doesn't mean you didn't steal something." "I'm not just any hospital worker, officer." Her voice was quieter now, but it carried a weight that made people lean in. "I'm the chief of surgery at Riverside Medical Center, And unless you have actual probable cause, you're violating my rights." Grady's face flushed, his ego pricked. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. You fit the description and I'm doing my job. Your job." Amara's voice rose now, no longer restrained. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and degrade, not to profile someone because of the color of their skin." The crowd had grown. At least 20 people now, phones raised, whispers spreading like wildfire. Grady glanced around, his confidence cracking at the edges. But he doubled down. "You're resisting. That's obstruction. I'm complying with every legal request you've made," Amara shot back. "What I'm not doing is letting you treat me like a criminal when I've committed no crime." Mills finally stepped forward, his voice firm. "Grady, that's enough. We got the wrong person. Let's go." But Grady wasn't listening. His pride was wounded, and wounded pride makes men dangerous. He reached for Amara's arm. "You're coming with me until we sort this out." That's when the second patrol car arrived. The door opened, and out stepped Captain Sarah Jennings, a tall black woman in uniform, her expression carved from stone. She took in the scene in seconds, the crowd, the cameras, Grady's hand on Amara's arm. "Officer Grady." Her voice cracked like a whip. "Step back. Now." Grady froze, his hand dropped. "Captain, I know exactly what you were doing, and you're done." She turned to Amara, her tone softening. "Dr. Stone, I apologize for this." Then she looked at Grady again, her eyes cold. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, badge and gun. Now." The color drained from Grady's face. "Captain, you can't." "I can, and I will. You've been warned before. This ends today." She turned to the crowd. "Thank you for recording. We'll need those videos for the investigation." Amara stood still, her breath coming slow and steady. Her hands no longer trembled. Grady stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, Mills trailing behind him in silence. Captain Jennings approached Amara, her voice low. "I'm sorry you had to go through this." Amara nodded slowly. "I want a formal complaint filed, and I want every second of this reviewed. You'll have it, I promise." The captain paused. "For what it's worth, thank you for keeping your composure. A lot of people wouldn't have." Amara's lips curved into the faintest, bitterest smile. "I shouldn't have had to." As the patrol cars pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, but the phones kept recording. The videos were already uploading, hashtags forming, a reckoning beginning. And in the driver's seat of her silver sedan, Dr. Amara Stone sat in silence, her hands gripping the wheel, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Because she knew something that Grady didn't, something that would unravel in the hours to come. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The video went viral before the sun set. By 6 o'clock that evening, Dr. Amara Stone's face was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit threads dissecting every frame, every word, every muscle in Officer Grady's sneer. The hashtag trended within 2 hours. Justice for Dr. Stone. The news vans arrived at Riverside Medical Center before Amara even made it home. They lined the entrance like vultures, cameras poised, reporters rehearsing their questions into compact mirrors. But Amara didn't go home. She drove to the hospital instead, her hands still tight on the wheel, her mind replaying the scene in loops she couldn't stop. The way Grady's eyes had narrowed, the way he'd said, "You people," like it was a fact, not a slur. The way Mills had looked away, complicit in his silence. She parked in her reserved spot and sat there for a long moment, staring at the glass facade of the building where she'd spent the last 12 years of her life, where she'd saved hundreds of lives, where she'd earned respect through skill, precision, and an unshakable work ethic, and yet, in a parking lot 15 minutes away, none of that had mattered. She was just another black woman, just another target. The anger that she'd contained in front of Grady now rose like bile in her throat. She let it come. She let herself feel it, all of it, because she knew that if she buried it, it would rot her from the inside out. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was different. Nurses stopped mid-conversation when she walked by. Residents stared. A few offered quiet nods of solidarity. One older surgeon, Dr. Patel, caught her in the hallway and gripped her shoulder without a word. His eyes said everything. Amara made her way to her office on the 4th floor, closed the door, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from colleagues, friends, strangers offering support, a few journalists requesting interviews, and then, buried among the noise, a message from an unknown number. It was brief, direct. "Dr. Stone, we need to talk. This isn't the first time Grady's done this. Call me." There was a phone number below it. No name. Amara stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She glanced at the clock. 7:15, then she dialed. The voice that answered was a woman's, low and careful. "Thank you for calling." "Who is this?" Amara asked. "My name is Monica Reeves. I'm an investigative journalist with the Tribune. I've been tracking Officer Grady for the last 18 months. There was a pause. "You're not his first victim, Dr. Stone. You're just the first one with enough visibility to make people pay attention." Amara sank into her chair, the weight of those words settling over her like a heavy blanket. "How many others?" "At least 7 that I can confirm. All women, all black or Latina, all stopped under questionable circumstances. Most were too scared to file complaints. A couple tried, but their cases went nowhere. Internal affairs buried them." Monica's voice hardened. "Grady's been protected. He has friends in the department, people who look the other way." Amara closed her eyes. She thought of the woman at the grocery store who might have looked at Grady and seen her own nightmare. The teenager pulled over on her way to school. The mother trying to get home to her kids. All of them swallowing their fear, their rage, their humiliation, because fighting back felt impossible. "Why are you telling me this?" Amara asked quietly. "Because you have something they didn't. A platform. A voice people will listen to. And because I have evidence. Body cam footage that was never released. Witness statements that were ignored. If you're willing to go on record, if you're willing to stand with the others, we can make sure Grady never wears a badge again. We can make sure this doesn't just disappear." Amara opened her eyes, staring at the framed diplomas on her wall. Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins residency, chief of surgery at 37. She'd built a life on precision, on control, on the belief that if you worked hard enough, if you were excellent enough, the world would see you for who you were. But excellence hadn't protected her in that parking lot. Her degrees hadn't stopped Grady from looking at her like she was nothing. "I'll do it," Amara said. "Tell me what you need." 2 days later, Monica Reeves published the investigation. It was a 12,000-word exposé that read like a horror story stitched together with receipts. Grady's disciplinary record, which should have gotten him fired 3 times over. Complaints that had been downgraded or dismissed. A pattern of targeting women of color in traffic stops that had no legal justification. And at the center of it all, the voices of the women he'd humiliated. Women who had been too afraid to speak alone, but found courage in numbers. Amara's story was the headline, but it wasn't the only one. The article included dashcam footage that had been suppressed. In one clip, Grady pulled over a young Latina woman and demanded she get out of her car at midnight on a deserted road. She was trembling, begging him to tell her what she'd done wrong. He never gave her a reason. In another, he searched a black woman's car while her toddler screamed in the back seat. He found nothing. He never apologized. The city exploded. Protests erupted outside the police station. Community leaders demanded accountability. The mayor held a press conference, promising a full investigation. Captain Jennings appeared on the local news, her face tight with anger, and announced that Grady had been terminated effective immediately. But the story didn't end there. Because 3 days after the article dropped, Amara received another message. This time, it wasn't from Monica. It was from Officer Mills. "Dr. Stone, I need to talk to you. Alone, please." She almost didn't respond. Mills had stood there in that parking lot and done nothing. He'd watched Grady humiliate her and only spoke up when it was too late. But something in the tone of his message made her hesitate. Desperation. Maybe even guilt. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, neutral ground, public enough to feel safe. Mills arrived 10 minutes late, his face drawn and pale. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He sat across from her, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Amara said nothing. She waited. Mills swallowed hard. "I should have done more. I should have stopped him sooner. I've been replaying it in my head every night and His voice cracked. "I was a coward." "Yes," Amara said simply. "You were." Mills flinched, but he didn't argue. "I want to testify. Against Grady, against the department. I have recordings, conversations where supervisors told us to look the other way. Instructions on how to justify stops that had no legal basis. I kept them because I knew deep down that what we were doing was wrong. But I didn't have the guts to come forward until now." Amara leaned back in her chair, studying him. He was young, maybe 28, still new enough to the force that the rot hadn't completely consumed him. But it had started. She could see it in his eyes. The shame, the realization that silence was complicity. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I have a daughter," Mills said, his voice breaking. "She's 3. And I keep thinking about what it's going to be like for her growing up in a world where people like Grady get away with this. Where people like me stay quiet because it's easier." He looked up at her, tears brimming. "I don't want her to grow up thinking her father was part of the problem." Amara felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding. She thought about all the people who had stayed silent over the years. The colleagues who witnessed discrimination and said nothing. The bystanders who looked away. And she thought about the ones who finally found the courage to speak, even when it cost them everything. "If you testify," Amara said slowly, "your career is over. You know that, right?" Mills nodded. "I know. You'll be ostracized, threatened. Some of your brothers in blue will never forgive you. I know that too." Amara studied him for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and sent a text to Monica Reeves. "There's someone you need to meet." 1 week later, the district attorney announced a grand jury investigation into systemic discrimination within the Riverside Police Department. Mills testified. So did Amara. So did 6 other women who had been victimized by Grady and officers like him. The department fought back. They hired expensive lawyers. They leaked stories to friendly media outlets trying to discredit the victims. They called it a witch hunt, a political attack, an attempt to undermine law enforcement. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings Mills provided were damning. The pattern was undeniable, and the public finally was paying attention. Amara stood on the courthouse steps after her testimony, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her face. A reporter asked her how it felt to finally have justice. She thought about that word. Justice. As if a terminated officer and a grand jury investigation could undo the humiliation, the fear, the rage. As if it could give back the sense of safety she'd lost. But she also thought about the women standing beside her, the ones who had found their voices, the ones who had refused to be erased. And she thought about Mills, who had chosen truth over loyalty, even knowing what it would cost. "This isn't justice yet," Amara said into the microphone, "but it's a beginning, and sometimes that's all we get to work with." The crowd behind her erupted in applause, but Amara barely heard it, because standing at the edge of the crowd, half hidden in the shadow of a building, was a figure she recognized, a tall man in a dark suit, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. And when their eyes met, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of the city. Amara's pulse quickened. She didn't know who he was, but something about the way he'd looked at her sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't over. The man in the dark suit haunted Amara's thoughts for days. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a bystander, someone curious about the spectacle unfolding on the courthouse steps. But the way he'd looked at her, that steady, penetrating gaze, felt too deliberate, too knowing. She mentioned it to Monica during one of their phone calls, her voice carefully casual, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a gnawing unease that kept her awake at night. Monica was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that feels heavy with withheld information. Then she said, "Describe him again." Amara did. Tall, maybe 6'2", dark suit, well-tailored, salt and pepper hair, clean-shaven, mid-50s she guessed, Caucasian, sharp features that looked like they'd been carved rather than formed. And he was just standing there, not with the press, Monica asked, apart from everyone, watching. Another pause. "I'll look into it." But Monica's tone had changed, and Amara recognized it. The journalist had shifted into hunt mode. Life at the hospital had become a strange paradox. Patients still needed surgery. Emergencies still arrived in ambulances, bleeding and broken, indifferent to the media storm swirling around their surgeon. Amara found solace in the operating room, where the rules were clear and the outcomes measurable. Scalpel, clamp, suture. Save the life or don't. There was no room for ambiguity in trauma surgery, no space for the murky gray areas that defined everything happening outside those sterile walls. She was 3 hours into a complex abdominal reconstruction when her phone buzzed in her locker, miles away in the doctor's lounge. She wouldn't see the message until she finished, wouldn't feel her stomach drop until she was washing the blood from her hands and finally checked the screen. It was from Monica. Just 3 words. "Call me. Now." Amara found an empty conference room and dialed, her wet hair still tucked under a surgical cap. Monica answered on the first ring. "The man you saw. His name is Richard Kellerman." The name meant nothing to Amara. Who is he? Officially, a private security consultant. Unofficially, he's a fixer. Works for wealthy clients, corporations, political figures, people who have problems that need to disappear quietly. Amara's grip tightened on the phone. Why would someone like that be watching me? That's what I've been trying to figure out. Monica's voice was taut. I started digging into Grady's background, looking for connections beyond the department. Turns out, his brother-in-law is a city councilman, Thomas Grady. And Thomas Grady has been receiving substantial campaign contributions from a patsy funded by some very influential people who do not like the direction this investigation is taking. The pieces began assembling themselves in Amara's mind, a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. They're trying to protect him, not just Grady, the whole system. It's bigger than that, Monica said. I found financial records showing that Kellerman's firm was paid $50,000 2 weeks ago by a shell company linked to that same pack. The payment was made 3 days after your incident went viral. The implications crashed over Amara like a wave. They hired him to come after me. I don't know yet, but Kellerman doesn't get hired to send greeting cards. His specialty is making problems go away. Sometimes that means discrediting people, finding dirt, creating scandals, and sometimes... Monica didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Amara sat in that conference room for a long time after the call ended, staring at the empty whiteboard on the wall. She thought about the women who had testified, about Mills risking everything to tell the truth, about the fragile momentum they'd built towards something that resembled accountability. And she thought about how easily that momentum could be destroyed. One planted story, one manufactured scandal, one perfectly timed revelation designed to shift the narrative from Grady's crimes to her supposed flaws. Or worse. She'd read enough news to know that whistleblowers had accidents, that activists sometimes disappeared, that speaking truth to power came with risks that extended far beyond reputation. She could stop. She could withdraw from the public eye, decline interviews, let the investigation proceed without her as its face. She could return to her surgeries, her comfortable life, the career she'd worked so hard to build. She could be safe. But then she thought about the next woman who would be pulled over by the next Grady, the one who wouldn't have cameras recording, the one who wouldn't survive the encounter. And she knew that safety was an illusion, a privilege she'd never really had, not in a world where her skin made her a target, no matter what letters came after her name. That evening, Amara did something she rarely allowed herself. She called her mother. Diane Stone answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and worry that only mothers seem to master. They talked about safe things at first. The weather, a cousin's wedding, a recipe Diane wanted to share. But Diane had always been able to read her daughter's silences, the spaces between words where truth hid. "What's wrong, baby?" she finally asked. Amara told her everything. The man in the suit, Kellerman, the implications, the fear she'd been trying to ignore. Diane listened without interrupting, a skill she'd perfected over decades of raising a daughter who needed to work through problems out loud. When Amara finished, the silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Diane spoke, her voice soft but iron-strong. "Do you remember what your grandmother used to say?" Amara did, but she let her mother continue. She used to say that fear is just your body's way of telling you that what you're doing matters, that easy things don't make you afraid, only important things do. Diane paused. "You're afraid because this is important, because it's dangerous, because it matters, and you've never run from things that matter." Amara felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking but blooming. She thought about her grandmother, who had marched in Selma, who had faced fire hoses and police dogs, and men with badges who saw her as less than human, who had done it anyway, not because she was fearless, but because she understood that some fights didn't wait for courage to arrive fully formed. You step into them afraid and find your courage in the stepping. "What should I do?" Amara asked, her voice small. "You already know," Diane said gently. "You've always known." The next morning, Amara called a press conference. Not the hospital, not the courthouse. She chose a community center in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, a place with chipped paint and worn floors and walls covered in children's artwork. A place that reminded everyone watching that this story wasn't about her credentials or her position. It was about every person who'd ever been made to feel small, threatened, disposable. The room was packed. Reporters, activists, community members. And there, in the back row, sitting perfectly still, was Richard Kellerman. Their eyes met across the crowded space. He didn't look away, neither did she. Amara stepped to the microphone, her hands steady, her voice clear. "My name is Dr. Amara Stone, and I'm here today to talk about power, about who has it, who abuses it, and what happens when we refuse to be silent about that abuse." She laid out everything Monica had uncovered. The pattern of discrimination, the protection Grady had received, the financial connections between police unions, political figures, and corporate interests that profited from a system designed to keep certain people in their place. And then she said the thing that made every camera flash simultaneously. I've been informed that powerful people have hired private operatives to discredit or intimidate those of us speaking out. I want to be clear. I will not be intimidated. I will not be silenced. And if anything happens to me, if I'm suddenly caught up in a scandal or an accident or an unfortunate coincidence, the world will know exactly who to look at. The room erupted. Questions shouted from every direction, but Amara kept her eyes on Kellerman. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not threatening. Something else entirely. Acknowledgement, perhaps. Respect for an opponent who just made the game significantly more complicated. He turned and walked out, and Amara knew with absolute certainty that she'd just painted a target on her own back. But she'd also made herself too visible to disappear quietly. Sometimes the only way to stay safe was to make sure the whole world was watching. That night, Amara returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. She froze in the hallway, her heart hammering. She hadn't been careless, she never was. Someone had been inside. She pulled out her phone, ready to call 911 when she heard a voice from within. "Dr. Stone, please come in, we need to talk." The voice was male, calm, educated, not Kellerman's. She pushed the door open slowly. Sitting in her living room in the chair by the window was a black man in his 60s, silver hair, expensive watch, suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He looked completely at ease, as if he'd been invited. "Who are you?" Amara demanded, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. "My name is Marcus Holloway," he said. "And before you call the police, you should know that I'm here to help you. Though I understand if you find that hard to believe given the circumstances of our meeting." He gestured to the couch. "Please, sit. What I'm about to tell you changes everything you think you know about what's really happening." Amara remained standing, her phone still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to call for help, to do anything except sit down across from a stranger who had broken into her home. But something in Marcus Holloway's demeanor stopped her. There was no threat in his posture, no menace in his eyes, only a kind of weary urgency, the look of someone carrying information too heavy to hold alone. "You have 60 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have you arrested," Amara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Holloway nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "I'm a former federal prosecutor. Spent 23 years with the Department of Justice, specializing in civil rights violations and systemic corruption. I retired 4 years ago, or that's what the official record says. The truth is, I was forced out because I got too close to something powerful people didn't want exposed." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I've been investigating the network protecting Officer Grady and men like him for the last 3 years. And Dr. Stone, what you've uncovered is just the surface." Amara lowered herself slowly onto the arm of the couch, not quite sitting, not quite trusting. "If you're one of the good guys, why break into my home like a criminal? Because every communication channel you have is being monitored. Your phone, your email, probably your car. Richard Kellerman doesn't work alone, and the people who hired him have resources you can't imagine. If I'd tried to contact you conventionally, they would have known before you finished reading my message." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. "I'm here because you're in more danger than you realize, and because you are also the first person in 3 years who's gotten close enough to actually do something about it." Amara felt the weight of those words settle over her shoulders. "Tell me what I don't know." Holloway reached into his jacket, moving slowly so she could see his hands, and pulled out a thin flash drive. "Everything is on here. Financial records, communications. A network that connects police unions, private security firms, political action committees, and some of the wealthiest families in this state. They've created a system designed to protect officers who enforce what I call informal social control. keeping certain communities afraid, certain people in their place. He set the flash drive on the coffee table between them. Grady isn't an anomaly. He's a tool. And the people using that tool have been doing it for decades, refining the system, insulating themselves from consequences. When someone like you threatens to expose it, they don't just try to discredit you. They try to destroy the entire framework you've built your credibility on, your career, your relationships, your sanity if necessary. Amara thought about Kellerman's smile in the community center, that acknowledgement of a game she'd only just realized she was playing. Why didn't you take this to the media, to the authorities? I tried. Holloway's voice cracked slightly. I brought what I had to my superiors at Justice. Within a week, I was accused of mishandling classified information. My reputation was shredded. My marriage ended because the stress became unbearable. I lost everything except the evidence I'd hidden well enough that they couldn't find it. He looked at her with something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. But you're different. You have public support, visibility. The video of your encounter went viral before they could control the narrative. You've got community leaders, activists, journalists all watching. You're too exposed to be quietly eliminated and too credible to be easily discredited. Amara picked up the flash drive, feeling its weight despite being barely heavier than a coin. What exactly is on here? Proof that the city council knew about Grady's pattern of abuse and actively protected him. Emails between Thomas Grady and police union leadership coordinating responses to complaints. Financial trails showing how campaign contributions flow from private security firms that profit from police contracts back to politicians who ensure those contracts continue. And communications between all of them and Kellerman's firm, discussing strategies for handling problematic voices in the community. Holloway's jaw tightened. There are also names. Other officers with similar patterns. Other victims who were paid settlements with non-disclosure agreements. A whole infrastructure built to ensure that what happened to you keeps happening, forever, to people with less power to fight back. Amara felt something shift inside her, a tectonic movement of understanding. This wasn't just about Grady. It wasn't even just about police misconduct. It was about a system that had learned to protect itself by making itself invisible, by fragmenting the evidence, by isolating each victim so they never saw the pattern. She looked up at Holloway. If I release this, they'll come after me with everything they have. Yes, he said simply. They will. They'll claim the evidence is fabricated. They'll dig into every moment of your past looking for ammunition. They'll threaten your medical license, your hospital, anyone who stands with you. And if that doesn't work? He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Then why are you asking me to do it? Amara's voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'm a 64-year-old man with nothing left to lose. I've already been destroyed. I can't be the face of this fight anymore. But you? Holloway's eyes blazed with something fierce and beautiful. You're a black woman who stood in a parking lot and refused to be diminished. You're a surgeon who saves lives. You're someone people see themselves in. If you step forward with this evidence, if you make them see not just Grady, but the whole machine that created him, you might actually break something that's been unbreakable for decades. Or at least crack it enough that the next person can break it a little more. Amara stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights scattered like fallen stars across the darkness. She thought about all the surgical procedures where she'd had to decide in seconds whether to take a risk that might save a life or play it safe and watch a patient die slowly. She thought about her grandmother's hands, scarred from work and protest, hands that had built things and torn down walls. She thought about the girls who would come after her, who deserved to grow up in a world where their excellence was shield enough, where their humanity was assumed, rather than something they had to prove with degrees and perfect behavior and swallowed rage. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked without turning around. How do I know you're not part of some elaborate setup? You don't, Holloway admitted. You can have Monica Reeves investigate me. You can take that flash drive to a cybersecurity expert and verify the metadata. You can sit on it for weeks doing due diligence. But every day you wait is another day they're working to undermine you, to shift public opinion, to make people forget why they were angry in the first place. Momentum is a living thing, Dr. Stone. It dies if you don't feed it. Amara turned back to face him. And if I do this, if I release this information and it doesn't change anything, if people look at the evidence and shrug and decide it's just how things are? Holloway stood, and for the first time she saw the full weight of his years in the slump of his shoulders. Then at least you tried. At least the evidence exists in the world instead of hidden on a flash drive in my storage unit. At least the victims whose stories are in those files will know someone cared enough to risk everything to tell their truth. He moved toward the door, then paused. My daughter would have been about your age now. She was killed in a traffic stop when she was 19. The officer claimed she reached for something. She was reaching for her phone to call me. By the time I got to the scene, they'd already constructed the narrative. Witnesses changed their stories. The dashcam footage was corrupted. The officer was cleared within a month. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled. I couldn't save her. I couldn't get her justice. Maybe I can help you get justice for all the others. Maybe that's enough. After Holloway left, Amara sat in the darkness of her apartment for hours, the flash drive on the coffee table in front of her like an unexploded bomb. She thought about calling Monica, about calling her mother, about calling anyone who might help her carry the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. But she knew this was a choice only she could make. Around 2 in the morning, she plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The files opened like a maze, folders within folders, each one containing another piece of the puzzle Holloway had spent years assembling. She read through emails where police union representatives discussed which city council members were manageable and which needed incentive alignment. She saw spreadsheets tracking complaints against specific officers, with notes about which complainants were credible threats versus which could be handled through standard protocols. She found contracts between the city and Kellerman's security firm, dated going back 7 years, for services described only as consultation and risk management. And then she found the video files, body camera footage that had never been released, dashboard recordings that had disappeared from evidence logs, cell phone videos from witnesses who'd been convinced to delete them, hours and hours of footage showing variations of the same scene. Officers pulling over black and brown drivers for reasons that ranged from flimsy to non-existent, searches conducted without probable cause, threats issued in voices calm and cold, and through it all the pattern Holloway had described. The informal social control, the message sent over and over that certain people existed at the mercy of those with badges and guns, and that mercy could be withdrawn at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Amara watched until she couldn't anymore, until the faces of the victims blurred together into a single face that could have been hers, could have been her mother's, could have been her grandmother's. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears that came anyway. She cried for the enormity of it, for the knowledge that she'd stumbled into something so much larger than one racist cop in a parking lot, for the weight of all those stories that had been buried, all those voices that had been silenced, all that pain that had been dismissed as the cost of maintaining order. When the sun rose, Amara was still sitting on her couch, exhausted but clear-eyed. She'd made her decision sometime in the dark hours, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Perhaps it had been inevitable from the instant Grady had looked at her with contempt and she'd chosen to meet his eyes instead of looking away. Perhaps it had been written into her bones by ancestors who'd faced worse and survived. Perhaps it didn't matter why, only that the path forward was suddenly, terrifyingly obvious. She called Monica first, Then she called a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protections. Then she called a press conference for that afternoon. No explanations, just a time and location. Let them wonder. Let them worry. She spent the morning copying the files, encrypting them, sending them to multiple journalists and activists with instructions to release everything if anything happened to her. Insurance of a sort. The kind of insurance that might keep her alive long enough to see this through. At noon, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Dr. Stone. Kellerman's voice was smooth as Riverstone's. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before this afternoon's press conference. Off the record, as they say. I don't have anything to say to you. I understand, but perhaps you'll listen for just a moment. He paused, and she could hear traffic in the background, car horns, the ambient noise of the city. You've been given information by someone who has reason to hold a grudge. Before you act on that information, you should know that there are consequences you haven't considered. Not threats, Dr. Stone, simply facts. Your hospital receives substantial funding from donors who prefer stability. Your colleagues depend on that funding. Patients depend on your hospital. Amara's grip tightened on the phone. If you're trying to intimidate me, I'm trying to give you a choice. Kellerman interrupted gently. You can walk away from this. Continue your excellent work as a surgeon. Live your life. No one would blame you. What happened with Officer Grady was unfortunate, but he's been terminated. The system worked, in its way. Justice has been served. Why risk everything for something that might change nothing? She thought about Holloway's daughter, about the women in those video files, about her own face reflected in her apartment window last night, wondering if this was how it felt to stand at the edge of something you couldn't come back from. Because the system didn't work, Amara said quietly. It failed 7 women before me. It failed everyone who's been pulled over, searched, humiliated, and beaten by officers who knew they'd never face consequences. It failed my grandmother when she was your age, and it's failing children right now. So no, Mr. Kellerman, I won't walk away. And if that makes me a problem for your clients, then I guess they'll have to figure out how to live with problems. She hung up before he could respond. Her hands were shaking, but she was smiling. 2 hours later, Amara stood before a room full of cameras and reporters and community members who had shown up because they sensed something significant was about to happen. She wore a simple black dress and her grandmother's pearls. She'd pulled her hair back, makeup minimal, nothing to distract from what she was about to say. Monica stood in the front row, giving her an almost imperceptible nod. Holloway was there too, in the back, his face carefully neutral but his eyes bright with something that might have been pride or might have been fear. And in the very back corner, watching through the window, was a figure in a dark suit. She didn't let herself look at him directly. Thank you all for coming, Amara began, her voice steady and clear. 3 weeks ago I was humiliated in a parking lot by a police officer who saw my skin before he saw my humanity. Today I'm here to tell you that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a system, and I have proof. The room fell silent. Not the polite quiet of anticipation, but the breathless hush that descends when everyone present understands they are about to witness something that cannot be undone. Amara reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, connecting it to the projection screen behind her. Her hands moved with surgical precision, steady despite the weight of what was coming. The first image appeared on the screen. A spreadsheet. Rows and columns of data that meant nothing to most people in the room until Amara began to speak. This document shows complaints filed against officers in the Riverside Police Department over the last 10 years. Each row is a complaint. Each column tracks what happened to that complaint. Notice anything unusual? She let the silence stretch. Let them scan the numbers. Let the pattern emerge. A journalist in the third row raised her hand. Most of them were dismissed or downgraded. 73%, Amara confirmed. Now let me show you something else. She clicked to the next slide. Another spreadsheet, this one showing campaign contributions, names, amounts, dates. These are donations made by police unions and private security firms to local politicians over the same 10-year period. Notice the timing. Every spike in donations corresponds to a period when controversial complaints were under review, and notice who received the most money. She highlighted a name: Thomas Grady, councilman, brother-in-law to the officer who had humiliated her in that parking lot. The room erupted. Questions shouted, cameras flashing. But Amara raised her hand, and the room settled again, hungry for more. I know what you're thinking. Correlation isn't causation. Politicians receive donations all the time. So let me show you the causation. The next slide was an email. The sender's name had been redacted, but the recipient was clear: Thomas Grady. The subject line read, Complaint Management Strategy. Amara read it aloud, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. We've reviewed the complaints against Officer J. Grady and recommend the following approach. Downgrade the excessive force allegation to discourtesy. The complainant has a prior arrest for marijuana possession, which undermines credibility. Standard settlement offer of $5,000 with NDA. Union will cover legal costs. Need you to ensure IA doesn't escalate to external review. She paused. This email was sent 3 years ago. Officer Grady remained on duty. The complaint disappeared. And 6 months later, he pulled over another woman. And another. And another. Click. The next slide showed a contract. Kellerman's firm. Services rendered to the city. $200,000 annually for crisis management and strategic communications consulting. Amara's voice dropped lower, forcing the room to lean in. Richard Kellerman's firm has been paid over $1.4 million in the last 7 years by our city. His specialty is making problems disappear, not solving them, disappearing them. And by problems they mean people like me, like the women whose stories I'm about to share. She clicked again. A face appeared on the screen. Young, Latina, beautiful and terrified. This is Maria Gonzalez. She was 22 when Officer Grady pulled her over on Route 7 at 11 p.m. She wasn't speeding. Her tail light wasn't out. She was driving home from her job as a waitress. What you're about to see is body camera footage that was never released to the public. It was buried in evidence storage and classified as corrupted. But someone kept a backup. Amara pressed play. The video rolled, grainy, but clear enough. Grady approaching the driver's side window, Maria's trembling hands on the steering wheel. The conversation that wasn't a conversation but a demonstration of power. Get out of the car. Why? Get out now or I'll drag you out. Grady opening the door. Maria stepping out, her voice breaking. Please, officer, I didn't do anything wrong. Turn around, hands on the hood. Please, do it. The search that lingered too long. Grady's hands moving over her body in ways that made everyone in the room understand. This wasn't about finding weapons or drugs. It was about control. About making her feel small. About reminding her that her body wasn't her own if he decided otherwise. The video ended. The room was silent again, but this silence felt different. Contaminated. Heavy with rage and shame and recognition. Because some of them had been Maria. Some of them knew Maria. Some of them had looked away when it could have been stopped. Maria didn't file a complaint, Amara said quietly. She was too afraid. But someone at the police department felt sick enough about what they'd seen to save the footage, to keep it safe until the moment it could matter. She clicked through 3 more videos, 3 more women, 3 more variations of the same violation. Each one had been buried, each one had been protected by the system Holloway had mapped. Each one was a daughter, a sister, a mother who had driven home that night with something broken inside her that might never fully heal. By the time the last video ended, people were crying. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A man stood and walked out, unable to watch anymore. The journalists had stopped taking notes. They were just witnessing, just trying to hold the weight of what they were seeing. Amara let the silence breathe. Then she spoke again, and her voice had changed. Softer now, more dangerous. The night after my encounter with Officer Grady went viral, I received a message. An investigative journalist named Monica Reeves told me I wasn't his first victim, that there was a pattern, that others had tried to speak up and been silenced. She gestured to Monica in the crowd. Together, we found 7 women, 7 that we could confirm, but the evidence I've been given suggests there are dozens more, maybe hundreds across multiple officers, all protected by the same network of political influence, union power, and private security firms hired to ensure nothing ever changes. She clicked to a new slide, a diagram, a web of connections linking police unions to politicians to private security to financial interests, complex and deliberate and undeniable. This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a system that creates bad cops and then protects them because it profits from the fear they generate. It's about communities that stay quiet because they've learned that fighting back costs more than suffering in silence. It's about power that has insulated itself so thoroughly that it believed it was untouchable. Amara's hands gripped the edges of the podium. But here's what they didn't account for. They didn't account for cell phone cameras. They didn't account for journalists who refused to stop digging. They didn't account for officers like Mills who chose conscience over loyalty. And they didn't account for the fact that sometimes someone they try to silence has a platform too big to bury. She pulled up the final slide. A list of names, officers, politicians, corporate executives, all of them connected to the network, all of them complicit. I'm releasing all of this evidence to the media today. Every document, every video, every email. I'm also filing a federal civil rights lawsuit, not just against Officer Grady, but against the city, the police union, and every individual who participated in or profited from this system of abuse and silence. And I'm calling on the Department of Justice to open a full investigation into systemic civil rights violations within the Riverside Police Department. The room exploded again. Questions coming so fast they overlapped into noise. But Amara wasn't finished. She raised her voice over the chaos. I know what happens next. They'll attack my credibility. They'll search my past for anything they can twist. They'll threaten my career, my safety, maybe my life. But I'm doing this anyway because the women in those videos deserved better. Because the next woman who gets pulled over deserves better. Because my grandmother fought for better and I will not dishonor her sacrifice by staying quiet when I have the power to speak. She stepped back from the podium. The questions continued, but she was done. She'd said everything that needed saying. Monica reached her first, gripping her arm, eyes shining. That was extraordinary. Other supporters crowded around, activists, community leaders, lawyers offering their services. The energy in the room had shifted from shock to something that felt almost like hope, fragile and fierce. But Amara's eyes searched the back of the room, the window where Kellerman had been standing. Empty now. He was gone. Or maybe just regrouping. Through the crowd, Amara saw Holloway. He hadn't moved from his position against the back wall. Their eyes met across the chaos. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and release. He'd carried this weight alone for so long. Now it belonged to all of them. Now it was too big to bury. Amara nodded back. A promise. She wouldn't let it be buried. Outside the community center, the protests had already begun. Word had spread faster than she'd imagined. Hundreds of people lined the streets holding signs. Justice for Maria. Justice for all. Black Lives Matter. No more silence. Chants rose and fell like waves. The energy was electric and dangerous and beautiful. News helicopters circled overhead. Live streams broadcast to thousands. This wasn't just local anymore. It was becoming something larger. A movement crystallizing around evidence that finally, undeniably, showed what so many had known, but couldn't prove. Amara stood on the steps, looking out at the crowd. She felt Monica beside her. Holloway had appeared on her other side. And then, emerging from the crowd, came the women from the videos. Maria Gonzalez, the others whose faces had been projected on that screen. They'd watched from the audience. And now, they were coming forward, climbing the steps to stand with her. No more hiding. No more shame carried alone. They stood together in a line as cameras captured the moment. 7 women who had survived, who had carried their trauma in silence because speaking felt too dangerous, too futile. But silence had become more dangerous than speaking, and futility had transformed into possibility. Maria reached for Amara's hand. Amara took it. Then the next woman's hand, and the next. They stood linked together as the crowd roared its approval and the cameras flashed. And somewhere in the city, powerful men who had felt untouchable began to understand that the ground beneath them was shifting. That night, Amara's phone rang incessantly. News outlets requesting interviews, lawyers wanting to join the lawsuit, politicians releasing statements supporting the investigation or denouncing it depending on who funded their campaigns. The hospital administrator called, his voice careful, saying they needed to discuss her future there. Her mother called just to say she loved her and was proud and terrified in equal measure. And at 11 p.m., another call from an unknown number. This time Amara answered immediately. She knew who it would be. Dr. Stone. Kellerman's voice carried none of its earlier smoothness. He sounded tired, almost human. That was quite a performance today. It wasn't a performance, it was the truth. Truth is a flexible thing. You've made this very complicated for a lot of people. Good, Amara said. It should be complicated. What they've been doing should cost them something. Kellerman was quiet for a moment. You understand they won't stop. The lawsuit will take years. They have resources you can't match. They'll drag this out, bleed you financially and emotionally until you wish you'd never started. Probably, Amara agreed. But they'll have to do it in public now, with the whole world watching. That's the difference between what happened to Holloway and what's happening now. You can't make this disappear. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, Kellerman laughed. It was a strange sound. Not quite bitter, not quite amused. You know, I almost admire you. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Maybe both, Amara said. Does it matter? I suppose not. The line went dead. Amara set her phone down and walked to her window. The city lights sprawled before her, thousands of lives moving through their nights, unaware or aware or somewhere in between of the battle being waged over how power worked and who it protected. She thought about surgery, about how sometimes you had to cut into healthy tissue to reach the infection beneath. How healing required trauma first. How some wounds had to be reopened before they could properly close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal maneuvers, media attacks, threats both subtle and explicit. The machine she'd exposed would grind on, trying to crush her beneath its wheels. But tonight, for just this moment, she allowed herself to feel what she'd accomplished. The evidence was out. The pattern was visible. The victims had been seen. It wasn't justice yet. Maybe it never would be, not fully. But it was something. It was a crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable. And through that crack, light was beginning to pour. 6 months passed like water through cupped hands, fast and slow at the same time. Each day brought its own battles, its own small victories and exhausting defeats. The federal investigation that Amara had called for was launched 3 weeks after her press conference. The Department of Justice sent a team of attorneys who spent months combing through files, interviewing witnesses, building a case that would either dismantle the system Holloway had exposed or validate the claims of those who insisted it was all exaggeration, all political theater designed to undermine law enforcement. The lawsuit moved through the courts with the grinding slowness that defines justice in America. Motions filed, motions denied. Discovery requests that turned into their own legal battles. The defendants hired prestigious law firms who deployed every delay tactic in their arsenal. They knew that time was a weapon, that momentum faded, that people forgot, that outrage had a shelf life measured in news cycles. They were right about some of it. The protests that had filled the streets that first week dwindled as summer turned to fall and fall gave way to winter. People had jobs to return to, children to feed, lives that couldn't be paused indefinitely for a cause that seemed to stretch toward a horizon that never grew closer. The news moved on to other stories, other outrages, the endless scroll of crisis and spectacle that defined modern attention. But they were wrong about other things. They were wrong about the women who had stood on those steps with Amara. Amara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She'd be proud. How could she not be? You made sure her story mattered, that it meant something. I hope so, Holloway whispered. God, I hope so. They finished their coffee in silence, two people bound by grief and purpose, and when they stood to leave, they embraced in a way that held all the words they didn't need to say. Outside, the city was turning toward spring, toward renewal, toward whatever came next. The lawsuit eventually settled. The city didn't admit wrongdoing, they never did, but they paid millions to the women who had been victimized. Funding for the reforms outlined in the federal report, money for training and oversight, and all the mechanisms that were supposed to prevent this from happening again. Amara knew that money didn't erase trauma, that settlements weren't the same as justice, but they were something. An acknowledgement, however grudging, that what had happened was wrong. Officer Grady never faced criminal charges. The statute of limitations had passed on most of his conduct, and prosecutors decided the remaining cases didn't have enough evidence to guarantee convictions. He lost his badge, his pension, his marriage. He moved to another state, disappeared into whatever life disgraced officers lived when the cameras finally looked away. Sometimes Amara thought about him, wondered if he felt any remorse, or if he'd convinced himself he was the victim, persecuted for doing his job. She suspected the latter. People rarely saw themselves as villains in their own stories. Thomas Grady lost his city council seat in the next election. The campaign contributions that had protected him became liability once they were exposed. His political career ended not with drama, but with quiet irrelevance, which was perhaps its own kind of justice. 2 years after that press conference, Amara stood once again on the steps of the community center. But this time it was for a celebration. The consent decree had been implemented. The police department had new leadership, new policies, new accountability measures. There had been a 60% decrease in complaints alleging discrimination. It wasn't perfect. Systems built over decades couldn't be dismantled in months. But it was progress, measurable and real. Maria Gonzalez stood beside her again, but this time she was smiling. She'd gone back to school, was studying social work, wanted to help others who had experienced what she had. The other women were there too, some of them, the ones who could face the memories without drowning. They'd survived more than Grady. They'd survived the aftermath, the scrutiny, the violation of having their trauma become public property. And they'd done more than survive. They'd transformed their pain into purpose. The crowd was smaller this time, maybe 100 people instead of thousands. But they were the ones who had stayed, who had kept showing up, who understood that change was measured in marathon distances, not sprints. Amara took the microphone. 2 years ago, I stood in a parking lot and was reminded that excellence isn't armor. That no matter how many degrees I earned, no matter how many lives I saved, there would always be people who saw my skin before they saw my humanity. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. I was angry. I'm still angry. But I've learned that anger isn't the opposite of hope. Sometimes anger is what hope looks like when it refuses to accept the world as it is. She gestured to the women beside her. We didn't fix everything. The system that created Officer Grady still exists in other cities, other departments, other places where cameras aren't rolling and witnesses aren't watching. But we proved something important. We proved that silence can be broken, that patterns can be exposed, that people with power aren't untouchable when enough voices say enough. Amara's voice softened. Someone once asked me if it was worth it. If standing up was worth everything it cost me. The sleepless nights, the attacks, the fear. And here's what I've learned. It wasn't about whether it was worth it. It was about whether I could live with myself if I stayed silent. And I couldn't. None of us could. She looked directly into the cameras that were still there, still recording, though fewer than before. If you're watching this and you've experienced something like what we experienced, I want you to know something. It wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve it. And your story matters, whether you choose to share it publicly or hold it privately. There's no right way to survive trauma. There's only your way. The crowd erupted in applause, but Amara barely heard it. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had marched in Selma and lived to see a black president who had died 2 years before Amara became chief of surgery. She wished her grandmother could have seen this, could have known that the fight she'd started was still being fought, still being won in inches and feet, still mattering. That evening, Amara drove to the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. She hadn't been there in months, too consumed with lawsuits and testimony and the endless grind of holding ground that was constantly being contested. She sat on the grass beside the headstone, tracing her fingers over the carved name. Diane Stone had asked her once what her grandmother would think of all this. Amara finally knew the answer. Her grandmother would have been terrified for her, would have wanted to protect her from the danger and the scrutiny and the cost of standing up. But she also would have understood why it was necessary, why some fights choose you rather than the other way around, why silence, however safe it feels in the moment, eventually becomes its own kind of violence. "I kept my promise, Grandma," Amara whispered to the stone. "I didn't run from things that matter." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees overhead, and for a moment Amara let herself imagine it was an answer, an acknowledgement, a blessing from hands that had built things and torn down walls and passed that legacy forward. She drove home as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much ugliness. But that was the paradox she'd learned to hold. Beauty and ugliness existed simultaneously, progress and regression, hope and despair. You couldn't wait for one to disappear before you embraced the other. You had to hold them both, let them coexist, and keep moving forward anyway. 3 years later, Amara was invited to speak at a conference on police reform. She almost declined. She'd been trying to step back from the spotlight, to return to being just a surgeon, just a person living her life. But the organizer mentioned that Officer Mills would be speaking too, sharing his perspective on what it took to break the blue wall of silence. Amara hadn't seen Mills since those random hallway passings years ago. She agreed to come. They met backstage before their panel, the awkwardness between them palpable. Mills looked different, thinner, grayer. The weight of what he'd done, the bridges he'd burned, showed in the lines around his eyes. "Dr. Stone," he said, "thank you for being here. Just Amara is fine." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mills spoke again, his voice rough. "I've wanted to apologize to you properly, for not stopping Grady sooner, for being complicit in a system I knew was wrong. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my cowardice." Amara studied him. She'd spent years being angry at Mills, at everyone who had stood by and let injustice happen. But anger was exhausting, and at some point, you had to decide whether holding on to it served you or destroyed you. "You testified when it mattered," she said finally. "You lost everything to tell the truth. That counts for something." "Does it?" Mills asked. "Does it really make up for all the times I stayed quiet?" "No," Amara said honestly. "It doesn't erase the past, but it changed the future. That has to mean something." They went on stage together and told their stories to an audience of police chiefs and activists and policymakers and people who were trying, genuinely trying, to figure out how to make things better. Amara talked about the cost of speaking up. Mills talked about the cost of staying silent. Together they illustrated what so many people struggled to understand. That there were no heroes in this story, no villains either, except maybe the system itself that made good people choose bad things and bad people feel justified in their cruelty. Just humans, flawed and complicated, trying to navigate a world that asked them to be better than they'd been raised to be. After the panel, a young black woman approached Amara. College age, maybe 21. She was trembling slightly as she spoke. "Thank you for what you did." I was pulled over last year by an officer who said things, did things that made me feel so small. I never reported it because I thought no one would believe me. But then I saw your story, and I realized I wasn't alone. I reported it. He was suspended. It's not much, but it's something. Amara felt tears prick her eyes. She pulled the young woman into an embrace. "It's everything," she whispered. "You speaking up is everything." And that's when she understood, finally and fully, what all of this had been for. Not for the federal reports or the settlements or the policy changes, though those mattered. It was for moments like this. For a young woman who found the courage to use her voice because someone else had used theirs first. For the ripples that spread outward from one act of defiance, touching people and places she would never see, creating changes she would never know about. That was the real victory, not perfection, not the complete dismantling of unjust systems, but the slow, incremental shifting of what people believed was possible, the gradual expansion of who got to be heard and who got to be believed. Years would pass. Amara would continue her work as a surgeon, saving lives in operating rooms that never made headlines. She would grow older, her hair silvering at the temples, her hands eventually becoming too unsteady for the precision surgery required. She would retire eventually, though not from the work of showing up, of speaking out, of being present for the battles that never really ended. And she would tell her story over and over to anyone who asked. Not because she wanted attention or acclaim, but because she understood that stories were how change happened. One person's courage giving someone else permission to be brave. One voice saying this happened to me and making it possible for another voice to say me too. The story that began in a parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday never really ended. It transformed, evolved, became part of the larger story of a country trying to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Some days that story felt hopeless, but other days it felt like exactly what her grandmother had always known. That progress was possible, that walls could be torn down, that systems built by humans could be rebuilt by humans. On quiet nights, Amara would sometimes return to that parking lot where it all began. The shopping plaza looked the same. People came and went with their bags and their routines, unaware that this ordinary place had been the site of something extraordinary. She would stand there and remember the fear she'd felt, the rage, the moment of decision when she could have stayed silent and didn't. And she would think about a question that had haunted her throughout everything that followed. What makes a person stand up when staying down is so much safer? She still didn't have a complete answer, but she knew it had something to do with recognizing that your life was never just your own, that you carried the dreams of everyone who came before you and the hopes of everyone who would come after. That silence might protect you in the moment, but it abandoned everyone else to face alone what you could have faced together. The parking lot held no answers, only memories. But as Amara stood there in the fading light, she felt something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because she had fought. Because when the moment came to choose between her safety and her integrity, between her comfort and her conscience, she had chosen right. And that choice, replicated across thousands of moments and millions of people, was how the world changed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but irreversibly. One voice, one story, one person refusing to be silent. That's how walls fell.